Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. I'm excited to be hosting you, Shaka Sali, in our brand new studio. Hello, Shaka. How are you?
Well, I remain simple, easy, and awesome.
A warm welcome to you all our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you live every Tuesday. And today we'll be talking about a wide range of issues, but let's start here in New York. Shaka, a lot of things are happening in New York. The 74th UNGA opened officially with the presidents of Brazil, United States, and probably the third speaker being the Turkish president speaking at the UN General Assembly. Your thoughts? Let's start there.
Well, first of all, it's an incredible, session, especially because if I may be allowed to be biased in favor of the mother African continent, this is a session that is being, in fact, chaired by an African president of the UNGA, a man who is called Professor Jibril Bande from Nigeria, and who happened to be a guest on Straight Talk Africa about 2 weeks ago.
Tanjin, just to correct you, Tanjin Mohammed Bande.
Jibril is his first name.
Okay. Yeah, very, very excited. I think he takes on the mantle of the UN General Assembly at a very interesting time. Everybody is talking about climate change and the impact it's had so far. When you look at what has been going on, there is this movement, especially led by young people, to be precise, Greta Thunberg, who has led this movement. What a remarkable young lady. What can you say about her movement?
You know, first of all, to be very honest with you, I have to say that she is uniquely and remarkably gifted as a leader, remarkably articulate. It reminds me of what I say sometimes, that all of life is about passion, action, and reaction. And to ignore the passion, action, and reaction of your generation is to risk having not really lived at all, occupying space. When it comes to Greta, she rejects occupying space. She is incredibly living, as a matter of fact, and she sets a very, very interesting and uniquely, precedent. And as really as somebody that will inspire her generation, because each generation, in sometimes, some ways, shape or form, has certain leaders. And I think that when you think about Greta, she obviously has to be one of those uniquely gifted leaders of her generation.
Why do you think young people are concerned about climate change? Is it a generational thing? Because it looks like older guys have given up on this planet, and young people are saying, no, we can't sit back. This is our time.
You see, I'm sure that you remember when you were young yourself. When you are young, you are very innocent, and you are very free to think, to explore, to imagine, to be creative, to be innovative. And I think that she's tapping into that. Young people are in the business of living for the moment, thinking about money, for example, to provide for their families or those that they are responsible for and all that kind of stuff. But as Greta said, we, the older generation, we expect these young people to go to school so that they can learn, so that in the future they will have had an investment in the future, so they can do well, live good lives and stuff like that. And yet, as Greta said, we are very busy actually taking away their future by the manner in which either we act or we do not act.
When you say, when she says that people are taking away their future. What does she exactly mean? Because it looks like this climate change thing has been around for a while, and people of, let's say, your generation have been doing something about it. Why is it more urgent now than it was ever before?
Well, it is always been very urgent because it is a planet that was, given to us by God to be able to live some kind of life, a life that has value. And I think that she realizes that there has been some kind of absence of leadership in terms of making sure that we protect this earth, this planet Earth, that in fact is our mother. We are very busy in a way polluting it and all that kind of stuff. And as such, we are not really being there for the younger generation, which is going to be living around for many, many years to come. Look at the Amazon, for example, in Brazil. You have a president who decided that it should perhaps be used for agricultural purposes and all that kind of stuff. Perhaps be used, in fact, for harvesting timber, and then make money and all that kind of stuff. And yet, I am not a scientist. Mind you, I was very scientifically challenged right from the word go when I was in high school. I never focused in science very much, but I'm told that when you think about the Amazon, you're almost talking about 20% of the oxygen that the world needs. And so we need to preserve the Amazon. We need to preserve forests like Mavira, the Mavira forest in Uganda. You remember at one time it was supposed to be sold to a very rich sugar, plantation mogul, Meta, so that they could get, sugar out of it by cultivating sugar cane and all that kind of stuff. But you had a lot of noise. You had noises not only from Uganda, but even from neighboring countries like Kenya and what have you. Why? Because like the Amazon provides that percentage of oxygen, Mavira forest also pretty much plays the same role in that particular region.
Let's go to the first question here. Let's go to Fred Kato Mutebi. What role can Africa play in averting climate change?
There's a lot that Africa can do. In fact, I'll give an example of a place where I was born. I was born in Kabale, southwestern Uganda. And as you know, Paul, it is a place that is at a very high altitude. To be very honest with you, when I was growing up, you could hardly hear anybody suffering from certain tropical diseases, such as malaria, for example. But now, occasionally, you get some people suffering from malaria. And why is that so? Because the environment has been tampered with. For example, the swamps. The swamps have been drained and recovered and put to use for agricultural purposes. The trees have in fact been cut down and what have you. The weather has even begun to change. So when you do those types of things, you are basically abusing the environment. And as you abuse that particular environment, in turn, it also abuses the human beings through things like diseases. New diseases are introduced, appear here and there, and what have you. So I think we need to be able to protect our environment. We need to make sure that the ecosystem really remains in harmony with human beings and all that kind of stuff.
Let's go to another quick follow-up here. Let's go to Zoe. Shaka, a lot of people think that international organizations are not effective when it comes to maybe spearheading such causes. For example, the climate issue. There is more talk, but less substance. How do you respond to that kind of criticism?
It is true, but I think that the first responsibility really is at the grassroots level. Is, for example, in your own neighborhood, before you really think in terms of the international community and what have you, as the great Tip O'Neill, who used to be the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives during the Reagan administration and what have you, used to say, all politics are local. Everything begins where you and I come from before we start thinking in terms of what is New York going to do, what is London going to do, what is Paris going to do, what is Geneva going to do. We should not be in a situation where we prepare our minds to expect what the Bible calls manna from heaven, because in fact it may not come.
Interesting. How about critics who say, for example, United States used to be at the helm of fighting for climate change, but over the years it has kind of slided back. You look at all like a country like China, one of the highest polluters on this planet. It's also not part of this conversation. So how about how can those small people who are saying, hey, you guys, whatever you're doing is affecting us, the small guys, how can there be a balance?
Yeah, but you see, we basically share this world with everybody. Even the Americans themselves need a leadership that will protect them. And the good thing about the United States of America, it is a democratic society. It is a reasonably open society where debate, for example, is part of the environment. People talk about things. People do not hide, things that affect them. There is a debate that is ongoing right now between those who believe, for example, that yes, there is this thing called climate change and it is very, very serious and it needs to be taken care of and people need to pay attention to it. And the only way they can do it is to follow the science. Because in fact, science has proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that climate change is present with us. And you can see it reflected, for example, in the manner in which the weather over time has been changing in the United States. You can see it in so many different ways. But there are also others who remain stubbornly thinking that no, climate change does not really exist. It is a myth. I think there is the need for education, for sensitization, for exposing people so that they can begin to understand that, look, this is something really very, very serious. This is major. And I think it's going to be done, and already it's being done. You can see, for example, how some of these individuals who are running for the next president of the United States, 2020, they're talking about climate change. And I think one of these days, you'll probably wake up and find that you have an occupant in the White House that realistically knows that that person who sits there, he or she has the responsibility of protecting his or his people.
Earlier we talked about the role being played by this young, remarkable lady, Greta Thunberg. What can young people in Africa maybe learn from her? What does it take for people in Africa to maybe borrow a leaf from her message?
I think that she inspires people of her generation, the young people, that they should not really wait for manna from heaven, that they should in fact get into the business of mobilization and organization. Mobilize and organize. You know, the Ghanaian founding president, the Osajefo, Kwame Nkrumah used to talk about organize, organize, do not agonize. Because when you organize, you come together for a specific purpose, and you are likely to achieve it. If you remain as an individual, yes, you can run very, very, very fast and probably win an Olympic gold medal. But in terms of getting very far, you need to be part of an organization. That is the only way you can accomplish things that affect all of us. And so I think that, first of all, you have to begin to understand that life is a struggle. And I think the young people need to organize themselves by mobilizing, of course, around certain issues that affect them, and make sure that they assert their presence, they assert their power, they send specific signals to their leaders and what have you, because at some point you find that there is an absence of leadership.
That's a perfect segue to our next segment. Let's go briefly to the United Kingdom, where the country's highest court has ruled in favor of, I guess, those who don't want the Prime Minister to get away with murder. For example, they just said that by him deciding to close Parliament, it was unconstitutional, therefore Parliament should be recalled. And for our audiences, a lot of people who have that British connection, what do you have to say about that?
It is very interesting because the issue obviously raises some very, very fundamental and important constitutional questions. First of all, we should point out from the outset that the United Kingdom is probably the only country that I know that has an unwritten constitution. So you pretty much go around tweaking it and what have you, because it is essentially based on tradition and conventions. In fact, there is a call now that perhaps they should look into the possibility of actually having a constitution that is written, where everybody will actually be able to read and understand exactly what is this constitution. And so you have a situation where, for example, the Prime Minister, Boris, he basically prorogued the Parliament. Another word might say probably suspension, suspended the Parliament. And now, with this kind of ruling from the Supreme Court, there are people now who are talking about how, for example, he basically misled the Queen. He misled the Queen, who obviously has the ultimate power to endorse whether or not Parliament is prorogued. Others, of course, are saying he lied the Queen, which is not something that anybody can be proud of. But I think that what it is that at the end of the day, Britain has basically proven that it is a parliamentary democratic society, and that nobody is above the law, not even the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Boris Johnson, is above the law or below it. It is a society essentially governed by the rule of law. And at the end of the day, it is democracy that actually has won the day.
So what's the future of Brexit then?
Well, the future of Brexit basically will be determined at Westminster, in the House of Parliament. It is up to the MPs who represent the people, who will either decide whether they should in fact go for a second referendum, or whether there should be a snap election so that they can deal with the issue of Brexit. Because, again, it's a generational thing. You have a situation where the older types of British are threatened by what is called globalization because they cannot compete. They do not have the modern technological skills in order to continue basically enjoying the privileges that they have enjoyed for very many centuries. Because you recall that at one time, the United Kingdom, or Great Britain as it was known at that time, presided over a territory where the sun never set. As a matter of fact, these days, it is reflected in some BBC news where you have a television program originating both from Singapore, when it is in the evening, for example, is in the morning, and then London, where it is in the evening.
Interesting.
Yeah?
Let's talk about the issue of globalization, but now let's take it to our own continent. Let's talk about xenophobia in South Africa in the context of globalization. We've dealt with this topic before, but we keep getting questions. What do you think? Let's go to Pedro. Do you think the envoy that South Africa is sending out because of the attacks on foreign nationals is a good move?
I think it is a good move in the sense that it reassures, for example, the leaders in these other African countries that what is happening in South Africa is not something that the authorities in South Africa can ignore, that they are in fact going to pay specific attention to the causes, for example, of why there is such a thing as xenophobia. As a matter of fact, there are people who think that given that it is an African situation, perhaps it should in fact not be called xenophobia, it should probably be called Afrophobia.
Interesting. How about people who argue that maybe globalization shouldn't work in that particular case because we are looking at countries, for example, the United States, in the case of Britain and other countries, who are saying, you know what, we are closing our borders. We no longer want people from different places to come and be part of our societies.
At the end of the day, really, I think that it's not something that you can sustain. Because whether you like it or not, the world is interdependent. And especially when you go in the context of Africa, you look at a country like South Africa. South Africa has, for example, the second largest economy on the continent, and has therefore tentacles across the entire continent. You're talking about MTN, for example, a very advanced, sophisticated telecommunications, cooperation and what have you. It is present in Nigeria. Nigeria is the essentially leading economic power on the African continent. South Africa has shopping malls all over, across the continent and all that kind of stuff. South Africa happens to be the only, perhaps, industrialized nation on the continent. And therefore, it needs really to deal with its brothers and sisters who come from elsewhere on the continent. And so it is not in their interest to isolate themselves, because what does it really benefit them? In what sense does it actually benefit them? It doesn't. So even the United States itself, it can talk the talk, but it can't walk the talk in terms of isolating itself. Because at the end of the day, it is the only superpower in this world, having obviously won the Cold War, because the other superpower was what was called the Soviet Union until it collapsed. And so the United States, if for nothing else, it has social obligations as a superpower. it cannot afford to isolate itself from the rest of the world. Because let's face it, you have the UN system, you have the Bretton Woods system, which are reflected in the International Monetary Fund, which are reflected in the World Bank. These institutions are there because, in fact, they were created by the United States following the end of the Second World War. Under the Second World War, the United States had to step in. At that time, it also had some people who actually wanted it to isolate itself, to adopt an isolationist sort of policy. And the others said no, especially FDR. They basically crossed the Atlantic and fought on the side of freedom and liberty, which of course was reflected in terms of defending Britain at the time, because it was actually being almost overrun by Germany and Adolf Hitler. Fascism would have been the alternative. And even though a former great British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, has said that democracy is the worst form of government, but he also said, except for the other ones.
Interesting. Shaka, I have a comment here. Somebody wants to get your wisdom on how can you help people who are hopeless, who don't have anything to look forward to? What is it that you can tell them to keep their hopes alive?
Well, first of all, words, by the way, can mean something. Words have inspired a lot of people, including the Shaka, the kid from Cavalry that you see here. I heard some people talk in a manner that was very inspiring, that it was in fact possible to go to the United States and go to school and liberate yourself from the sort of intellectual kwashako, the sort of intellectual malnourishment. And I was able to follow that. And if it can work for me, surely it should be able to work for millions and millions of others who can listen and get inspired by some words. For example, you remember a great man called the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He at one time talked about how, for example, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And he was right. He talked about racism. And he said, yes, I have experienced racism, and there are a lot of people who experience racism. But I have come to the mountaintop, and I have a dream that one day my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for those good words of wisdom and for inspiring a lot of young people out there. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time.
It was a pleasure.
British reporters would have asked.
Now that we have that out of the way, he's not, I'll tell you, I know him well, he's not going anywhere, don't worry about him. Okay, go ahead, any other questions?
Any advice for the Prime Minister as how he should deal with the judges?
No, I think he's dealing very well. Everything I see is what, look, I watch it very closely. He's a friend of mine. I tend to watch Friends.